Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello, my guest is Martin Ellington. He is a best-selling author and award-winning screenplay writer. He's director of Messflix, a production and publishing company. He has formerly been a general manager at car dealerships and financial offices, and he has authored a recent book called Devolution of a Species, Planet Earth is Fighting Back. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading your novel about what's happening here on our planet, and it really was written in such a way that I didn't want to put it down because I wanted to see how did it end. But before we talk about that, explain the concept that you used of the Gaia Hypothesis in developing this storyline.
The Gaia Hypothesis was originally proposed by James Lovecock when he worked for NASA, and they were looking at planets that we could move to. And the basis of it is that rather than a planet being rock with individual life forms on it, it is itself a living organism. So in the way that the human body is made up of billions of cells, we consider ourselves to be a single living entity. And this hypothesis, although it's been largely disproved and put to one side now, really intrigued me, and I just felt that if the Earth had had enough of us, if the Earth wanted to do a reset and take away its biggest threats, which clearly we are, how would it go about doing that? And so I started to really intrigue me, and I started to look into the mechanics of, in a fictional way, how it would do that. And I thought, well, it won't do it through the animals because we're the top species, we're the dominant species, which is strange because when you think about it, we can't fly or run very fast. We're not particularly strong pound for pound. We can't really swim very well. But what gives us our dominance is our brain. And so I figured, well, the Earth, that's probably what planet Earth would take away, would be our intelligence. And if it took our intelligence away and we went back to sort of a pre-industrial state, then everything that we do that pollutes the planet and harms the planet would cease to happen. And as we saw in the pandemic when cities shut down, how quickly the waters of Venice cleaned and how quickly the air cleaned around cities. And so the next challenge then was to sort of figure out how it would do it and how that would work. And I went down the line that humans interbred with Neanderthals, and generally we have a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in us. And so nature had kind of put this reset switch in so that once carbon dioxide levels reached a certain point, it switched on this reset and we basically evolved and became sort of human Neanderthal hybrids. So that was the basis. That's how I figured I could sort of get the point across and tell the story.
The Gaia Hypothesis is well accepted among environmentalists, but has it been accepted by the scientific community, or is it still considered a controversial theory?
My understanding is that it hasn't been accepted by mainstream science. What I wanted to know from the Gaia Hypothesis was the basic understanding. So, for instance, the daisy world theory is that if you have a world full of black daisies, they will heat the planet up because they absorb the heat from the sun and then radiate the heat back out. But if you have a world of white daisies, it doesn't warm the planet up because they reflect the heat. They don't absorb the heat to then re-release it. That's sort of the standard example of how the Gaia Hypothesis works. It's a very simple example of it. It's much more complicated than that.
How do you describe the plot in your book?
The plot is that planet Earth needs to stop us. It has an infection, it has a cancer, and it needs to stop us before we destroy it and all of the other species on the planet. And so in the way that our bodies fight an infection, it begins to fight back.
You took a theme that I have maintained for many years of humans aren't really necessary for survival by the other plants and animals. We are causing their extinction. They don't need us. And that it would be interesting where humans are removed. As you said, during the pandemic with the lockdown, we saw cities clean up their air and water. We've seen in war zones where there's a space between the different fighting areas that the wildlife have come back when humans are not in those locations. The humans are a species that maybe the planet Earth doesn't need.
Well, I agree. I mean, we are by nature an invasive species, and that's what we are. And in devolution, that's how planet Earth sees us. It sees us as an invasive species, and in the way that our body would fight an invasive virus or whatever, that's what planet Earth does. If every human on this planet disappeared tomorrow, my understanding is that the ecosystem would not collapse. If sharks disappeared, the ecosystem would collapse. When wolves were back reintroduced into Yellowstone, the ecosystem adjusted. They were necessary. And so you're right in that we are really not needed by the planet, which is quite disturbing and daunting all at the same time.
You mentioned Neanderthals, and when I studied anthropology in the 1960s, Neanderthals were considered an early evolution of Homo sapiens, but recent research in the last few decades have made Neanderthals a separate species of hominids. And your book takes the concept of the Neanderthal DNA mixing with the human DNA. I think they say there's about 4% of DNA of Neanderthals in human beings.
Yeah, it's around that figure, yeah. Mainly in Europeans, much more so in European ancestry than African or Asian ancestry.
But yet Neanderthals did not win out. Human beings did. In doing your research for your book, Devolution of a Species, you looked into that Neanderthal human Homo sapien connection. What is the current theory?
The current thinking, it seems to change quite a lot, because I wrote this book originally back in 2017, so all the research I did was in 2015-16. The current thinking is that Neanderthals were much more intelligent than we originally gave them credit for. The Homo sapiens, us, we did what we've done to every species that we've ever encountered when we've moved into an area. We've either killed it or we've outbred it and stripped the resources and taken its resources away, driving whatever species it is away until it eventually faced extinction, of course. But we did interbreed. We know we interbred with Neanderthals. That is documented, and as I said, mainly in Europeans, but DNA is found throughout the world, as it is with denivizens in parts of Central Asia. It did happen. So the research was really interesting, and of course, devolution of a species. What I've tried to do with devolution is get a message across, but I've tried to do it in a way that's entertaining and is set against a horror background, and it's dystopian and it's post-apocalyptic, and it tells the fall of the human empire, I guess, if you want to term it that way.
I don't like to give out the plot because I want people to read the book. You mentioned civilizations, and in the plot line, you talked about how governments and societies were collapsing one after another as people got infected with this DNA, and you're calling from the United Kingdom, and in the book, you had the monarchy just say the government doesn't exist anymore.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing with society that we take for granted is it's really on the knife's edge. It wouldn't take a lot. The tipping point isn't that far away, and it isn't a big tipping point either. I think once a certain percentage of the police and the army and the people in charge became infected, if this was a real-world situation, how many police officers would show up for work if their family began to show symptoms, if most of their colleagues decided not to show up for work?
Or you had the infrastructure where nobody was taking care of the water, the power, and food wasn't able to be made available because of transportation problems. Everything just started falling apart.
Yeah, and I think it would happen fairly quickly.
Normally, I am reading nonfiction books about the ecological crisis, and I'm reading about devastating situations, pollution, species extinction. It was a pleasure to read a novel, although the plot line and what occurred and what finally happened was a little tough to take.
Sadly, it's the direction we're heading. I don't know how to course correct. Does anybody really know how to course correct, or even if we can course correct at this point? And that sounds bleak, but sometimes I get the feeling that we're frogs and the water's just heating up around us, and we either don't want to know or we don't know. That's the sadness. And I have children, so I need them to know.
You have written screenplays, books. Your new book, Tomorrow's Flight, is another novel. Are you going to be writing stories about humans abusing other species?
I'd like to revisit Devolution of a Species. The way that the book ends lends itself to a sequel.
Perhaps you better summarize the whole story of Devolution of a Species, Planet Earth is Fighting Back.
It's an interesting story because, as I said, it delves into the Gaia Hypothesis, and it delves into what if the planet Earth is actually a living organism. It's not just a rock in space with individual species on. But when I wrote this book, I wanted to write it from the point of view of the people who were trying to solve the problem, the people who were working on the inside, who were trying to investigate these unprecedented acts of violence that were coming along, the changes in people. It's not socioeconomic, it's not religious-based, it's not territorial-based, it doesn't follow the normal patterns. The governments in devolution didn't know how to handle it or track it or predict it because it didn't follow the normal norms of these sort of things.
And originally, you pointed out that the governments all thought that they were dealing with a virus, when in reality, your storyline said that it was the evolution of Homo sapiens and the DNA of Neanderthals taking over.
Yeah, originally the governments believed that it was a virus and that it was being spread around the globe by air currents because it sort of tracked the pattern of the air currents. But it isn't. It isn't an airborne virus. It is this reset switch that nature built into us. One of the things I wanted to do, which is very different to sort of The Walking Dead and things like that, which is zombies, this isn't zombies, is I wanted to explain, I wanted the reader to understand what was happening and why it was happening, and not just that it isn't happening. I wanted them to be in the mindset of the scientists that were actually trying to solve the problem, fix it, stop it.
And you also point out that the governmental agencies were ignoring some of the new scientific concepts and weren't willing to spend money to explore whether or not that was a theory that was actually causing the problem. And of course, that's an important issue in all of the environmental issues that we have to deal with, is looking at what is causing the problem and exploring all the options. I want to thank you so very much for this exciting novel. Quite frankly, I hope that it's truly fiction and won't happen, but it certainly was compelling to think about what could happen if we don't be more careful about what humans are doing to the ecosystem.
Thank you, Nancy. I mean, the whole point of the novel was to get a message across, was to get people to think about what could happen and to make them think, to get them to think about what we're doing, but do it in an entertaining way with a bit of good old-fashioned horror thrown in.
You succeeded.
And yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, yeah. As a writer, that's good to hear. Thank you.
The novel is a great reminder, and certainly one that reminds us in a very entertaining way. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you very much for having me.
I have been speaking with Martin Ellington, who is an author and screenwriter, director of Mess Flicks, and author of Devolution of a Species, Planet Earth is Fighting Back. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.